Good morning. I trust that everyone rested well and had a good breakfast and is ready for a full day of presentations and conversation together around interfaith engagement. A couple little quick housekeeping things. Again, if you find yourself out of doors and need in of doors, make sure you have my mobile number, 615-686-9252. And if you send me the right emoji, I'll come and open the door for you. You've probably already found the restrooms, but they're out that door down the hall on the left-hand side. There's coffee over here, and we'll have coffee breaks and lunch all in here today. So you won't have to go out. It is supposed to start raining and whatnot around 11, but we'll be safely in this room. This morning and actually today in many places around the United States, young people are gathering together to stand up to march for their lives. And I know that many of us, perhaps all of us, stand in solidarity with them. Many of our students are there. I know my family will be at the march here in Nashville. They're probably already downtown. But it really is a march for their lives. And I was thinking about this morning, that perhaps all the thoughts and prayers over the last 10 years are starting to take effect. And this is God's answer. So let us keep our young people who are leading us at the front of our minds as we have conversations about how we live together well with one another in conflicted times so that we might seek peace together. So in my mind, this is one of the reasons why we're gathered to have these kinds of conversations, to seek understanding of one another so that we can disagree, but disagree in peaceful ways and live together in that way. Does anyone have any questions that they think would be good for all that they need answered? Otherwise, I'm going to turn this over to the Reverend Dr. Timothy Moore, who's right there in front of me. Hello. All right, we're going to be underway.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to invite Eva up and then Wesley. Is Wesley in? He was out in the hall a second ago. There he is. He's here. We'll invite them up for our first panel. It's a privilege to be here with you today. I'm going to go there and sit down in a second, but first I'm going to do some kind of housekeeping, not for the meeting today, but for our panel discussions to give us some sort of shape and direction to our work. So there are going to be a series of panel discussions this morning and this afternoon, and these panel discussions are shaped and designed around the chapters in the book and then the different sections in which the chapters belong in the book. So if you haven't had a chance to read the book or haven't had a chance to look through it, you just simply could flip to the index at the front, and that'd be very helpful, or the table of contents at the front. That would be very helpful to give you some sort of shape and direction to what it is that we're doing today. And so we're starting off with the collection of essays or chapters that belong here in the beginning. The three of us have contributed to that section. It's the section on sort of historical structures. And so that's why we are clustered together. Mark and I went back and forth and trying to decide how to organize everybody into the book. And so the first section we did was on history, and so we decided that these three chapters seem to have some sort of commonality in some of the historical work that we do. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in a second, but first just to give you a general idea of how the morning will progress with each of the panels, and then the afternoon will probably reflect that as well, is that each of the presenters will have sort of 5 to 15 minutes to present their chapter, their essay. They're under no obligation to summarize the entire thing, but to do it in a way that seems useful and helpful for us in this particular context. So we'll spend sort of that 5 to 15 minute window to do that. Then we'll do some, with our discussion here today in this particular section, the way I'm going to run it is we're going to do some table conversations after that around the presentations that have been done. and I'll give you some direction for that as well. And then we'll do some general Q&A back and forth. So you can ask some questions of the panelists, the essays that we have, but also just we can respond to each other's questions that have prompted because of the conversations that happened at the tables. Does that make sense, or how we're going to move forward here today? All right, so that's the general way forward. Just to give you a little bit more of an overview, so this is the historic section of the book, and in the sense that we're trying to give you the backdrop against which the rest of our conversations might be happening. So we're going to focus this a little bit. So Wesley's chapter is a bit on historic framing, particularly from the Methodist perspective. But there's a larger piece in there that has to do with the general ecumenical movement and the missionary movement and how those deal with the issues of interfaith, interreligious dialogue. But they provide some historical framing. And then Eva's section is a specific kind, almost like a case study of an individual campus and how some interfaith and ecumenical work went in together to actually to deal with a particular problem, a particular issue in a particular place. And then mine is what I describe as a diagnostic framing. It tries to do a diagnostic naming of some larger narratives that are at work that seem to be happening and engaging on our campuses at a given time. So that is how we're going to begin. I think I will go first, and then Eva, if you'll go next, and then Wesley, just in the order we are in the program. And I think Eva, you have a PowerPoint, so make sure they know she'll be up second. Good. All right. They're good. All right, we're ready to go. All right, good. So I'm going to go grab some papers. I'm going to pass these around. Actually, I'll do that at the end. I'll pass those around after we talk. But first, I'll do my presentation, and then we'll kind of work our way down the table, and then we'll do some questions amongst ourselves. All right. Thank you, ma'am. Speaking of hymns. So to add a bit of confusion to this whole process, if you notice the name of my chapter is Annotations on Chapter 3. Right, and so first I'm going first this morning, and I'm the second chapter in the book, and I'm not doing annotations on the third chapter in the book at all, which is Eva's chapter. So that's not what that means. I'll hopefully give some sort of explanation of what I mean by annotations on chapter 3 as we go along. So education, particularly higher education, has always been important to the Methodist movement. I meant to ask, can everybody hear okay? Everybody get the sound? Okay. So it's always been important to the Methodist movement. By 1748, so if you know anything about the early formations of Methodism within the British context, Wesley's heart was strangely warmed in 1738. By 1744, they were having the first annual conference, first gathering of Methodist ministers. By 1748, Kingswood School has been established. Right? That's one of the first and permanent schools that exist within the Methodist system. And to this day, it still exists in Bath, England. Right? So early on, education was very important in the Methodist system. All right? It was reiterated that at the Christmas conference in 1784, when they organized Methodism that became the foundation for the denomination that is now the United Methodist Church. When that Christmas conference happened in 1784, one of the first things they did was they established a college called Cokesbury College. Right? Now, that college doesn't exist anymore. It was in Maryland. It was burned down several times, and eventually it closed. But regardless of its less than glorious history, it indicates an impulse within Methodism to have a college, and the education was important from its very earliest foundations. And there was something distinctive and important about Cokesbury College is it was not meant to be a college in the same way that Kingswood School was meant to be a school. Kingswood School was meant to be a school that was to educate children. Cokesbury College, always from its outset, was meant to be a higher education institute. All right, so very early on, Methodism understood education to be important. By 1790, Francis Asbury, one of the founding bishops of the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States, he says in the minutes of at the General Conference, he says, institutions should, quote, teach learning and piety. Right? That's one of the founding statements, and very early on within Methodism, the institutions should teach learning and piety. So there's always a tension within Methodism and the institutions that they have to be a place where learning is offered and piety is elevated. Right? So how do you live within that tension? Like, how does that tension exist in the campuses that it creates? Right? So over the history of the United Methodist Church, particularly in the United States, there have been hundreds of colleges. There's still to this day 119 institutions that are affiliated with the United Methodist Church. Right? So all of them are places where somehow, at least in their founding principles, the idea that learning and piety exist together in some sort of a tension. Now that tension has shifted over time, but that tension was at the founding. All right. So my paper explores what it means to teach learning and piety in our contemporary educational context, right? So it was a long time ago, 1790. Things have changed, right, since 1790. So when Asbury says that we should worry about teaching learning and piety, his context is different than our context, but how do we take that and move it forward to today? So more specifically, this essay examines the possibility of a positive impact that faith might have on the educational enterprise, right? So how might faith have a positive impact on the educational enterprise? And so the essay itself is divided into two sections. The first section considers Sam Wells' three-chapter typology for framing, the way he uses to frame as a device to view higher education context in the United States and its current context. And then the second part of the chapter of the essay is a presentation of a specific practice on a campus that tried to implement sort of a faith practice as a way of furthering the educational enterprise. So today I'm going to spend more of my time outlining what Sam Wells' argument, just for time's sake. So I'm going to try to outline Sam Wells' argument. And we can talk more about the particular practices that are described in the essay, but just for time's sake, we're going to do the first part. And so Sam Wells, to give you a little bit of background, Sam Wells formerly was the dean of the chapel at Duke University. So he was the senior religious officer for Duke University. So he followed when Will Willimon, who had been the dean of the chapel for about 25 years, was elected bishop by the United Methodist Church. He left, and then they replaced Will Willimon with Sam Wells. And Sam Wells was the first United Methodist to serve as the dean of the chapel at Duke University. So that's sort of a big deal for Duke. But Sam is Anglican, so he's actually from England. And so not only was he not United Methodist, he was not an American, right? So then he comes and he takes over this position as dean of the chapel. And one of the first things he begins to do is to do an assessment of the campus, because he came in, he had sort of this dissonance of an experience. He didn't quite understand the environment to which he had come, because the environment from which he came in England was radically different than the environment he found at Duke University. And then he was asked to begin to develop religious life in this particular context. He realized he didn't really understand this context at all, where he was asked to begin to develop religious life. And so he began to do an assessment. And this assessment he ultimately kind of penned into an essay which describes the contemporary religious context in our college campuses, or the contemporary tension between learning and piety in our college campuses as three different chapters that are happening, right? And these three different chapters have different states of origin, but he says that the complicated thing that is going on is that those three different chapters, one did not end and the next one start, they overlap, and they are concurrent. So when chapter 1 is joined with chapter 2. Chapter 1 doesn't vanish. Chapter 1 still exists, but then now chapter 2 is laid on top of it. And then chapter 3 begins. Chapter 3 is laid on top of chapters 1 and 2. So they're all concurrent chapters being told about the. And so the dissonance comes, particularly, he says, is that people are talking about the tension between learning and piety, and they think they're talking about the same thing, but they're really talking about it from the position of their three different chapters that they occupy on the campuses. And so those people are using the same language, the same vocabulary, talking about the same subject matter, and they think they're talking to each other, really talking past each other, or not even near each other. And so when I talk about, I'm doing an annotation on chapter 3, my annotation is an exploration of his third chapter that he's describing. So that hopefully explains why I described my chapter as what it is. All right. He begins by saying that there's something as a prologue. He didn't really get into that, but the prologue he essentially says is that the founding of many of our major schools in the United States were founded by religious institutions. That happened prior to the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time, there was not really much kind of self-reflection on the tension between what it means to be a religious school and what it means to be connected to or affiliated to a denomination, and what that means to be a place of higher education. They simply just existed together, and no one really thought much about it. Then he says that's prologue. Chapter 1 is the beginning of the 20th century, the first part of the 20th century. And so the first part of the 20th century, he says, is a time when faculties in many of our church-related colleges wrested control for those of those institutions away from their ecclesial hierarchies. Denominations, he says, traded their theological identity in order to retain their institutional influence. So what this means is they segregated the intellectual efforts of the university as a public good from the private ponderings of faith and the inner life. So it's a public-private split. So the intellectual life becomes a public good, the spiritual life becomes a private attribute, and they can exist simultaneously on the campus as long as they do not intersect much. Relationships of faith and knowledge shifted from mutually informing each other to mutually tolerating each other, while they occupied a different sphere in the same campus. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, he says, refers to the period of a significant social change in the third quarter of the 20th century. The way the story is remembered is that excluded groups beat down the door of segregation and restricted access. White Anglo-Saxon males stopped being seen as the source of all good and started being fingered as a cause of all evil. So the role of faith's presence is questioned on the campus. This time, rather than occupying different space that tolerated each other, suspicion replaces tolerance, and pluralism becomes a leveling mechanism. Pluralism, meant to supply an intellectual stalemate, assumes a central role in the academy. And in this case, when we're talking about pluralism, we're not talking about pluralism in the way that a sociologist would refer to pluralism. We're talking about just a variety of people who occupy the same place. You're talking about a kind of pluralism that's a philosophical or theological kind of pluralism, which is essentially we're all saying the same thing using different words, right? So that's theological pluralism. So it's not Diane Eck, it's John Hick, right? So to give you some sort of categories in which to put those in, all right? And oftentimes, that gets confusing, too, when you talk about religious pluralism, is that some people are using that same descriptors, but they're talking about two radically different things, okay? So he's talking about the second of those categories. All right, and so now he says we're in chapter 3. So chapter 3 exists, and he said that arises at the latter part of the 20th century, the early part of the 21st century, so the time in which we sit now. So this labors to protect particular faith and all faith from marginalizing forces of chapter 1 that seek to sequester faith from conversations and thoughts that matter, or from the diluting forces of chapter 2 that seek to relativize or equate everything. So this is going to be a quote from Wells. I'm going to offer you a long quote here. He says, quote, I do not believe that my own faith, Christianity, was a manifestation of a broader genus known as religion. My relationship with members of other faiths was not dependent on us all agreeing there was some kind of more fundamental subsoil from which we all derived, some kind of spiritual or philosophical nutrients. I was not trying in an aggressive and imperialistic manner to say I'm right and you're wrong. I was just pointing out that there was no philosophically coherent way in which we could both be right, and that pretending otherwise would only underwrote a culture in which it was widely assumed that neither of us were seriously interested in truth in the first place. Hence, my fear that a definition of religion would render us all irrelevant, because it would expose us all as half-baked forms of self-help and therapy. So the mandate he was given by the university was to develop religious life. And so they simply wanted a common definition of religion. And so he was wrestling with the idea he couldn't offer the university a common definition of religion that would sort of allow everybody to participate, or that would capture everybody's faith practices. He was trying to be honest to the fact that people actually disagree with each other, and how do we create space where disagreement is okay, and to live within that tension. Similar to what Ibu had mentioned last night. And so if the first chapter was characterized by marginalization and tolerance, the second chapter is characterized by suspicion and pluralism, then the third chapter, in my estimation, is characterized by mutuality and hospitality. So this is the way we create this space. And so mutuality is meant to be a recalibration of the system, rejecting the structural assumptions that faith is only relevant in intellectual discourse if it is privatized, or that faith is only acceptable in intellectual discourse if it is a subgenus of a larger claim that is general to all, irrespective of a particular faith tradition. Rather, mutuality assumes that interlacing, informing, and sympathetic presence of a discrete and probably disparate narratives. So the narratives can inform each other and even change each other, but to recognize that they are actually different narratives happening. So hospitality is the methodology established to share that jointly occupied space while willfully naming a specific space as particular in character and disposition, yet not intended to be hostile or dismissive of others. It is about engagement, not confrontation. So the idea is that can you create a context that is birthed out of a particular position, that position that is intentionally open and hospitable to others, but doesn't negate its original founding. So it's a different way of trying to wrestle with this tension between learning and piety. Right? So then the second part of the essay deals with an exercise to try to do that and some empirical evidence that hopes to suggest that at least leaned that way. So that's the part of the chapter I want to offer for you today. So we'll allow that to bounce around in your heads for a little bit, and we're going to move down the table to Eva. But we'll come back to these at the end, and we'll do that a little more directly. But thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you to Melissa and Alan for saving my presentation so you could see part of it today. The title of the chapter is much longer, as you will note. And to keep myself focused so I don't go on and on as if I'm doing a 50-minute class period, I thought I would subtitle it here, The Cause in Common of the Religious. And I am just thrilled that we can connect so well today and tonight because last night Dr. Patel spoke to us, and this is my assessment, is that the campus has resistance. Resistance to being comfortable, resistance so that we can have critical self-examination of our own comfortableness, our intellectual, social, and political comfortableness, because sometimes we get complacent. One person asked, where are the limits of the diversity and of all of this? And another one asked, when should one determine that changing minds is not possible? And then, of course, concluding with putting us all more uncomfortable by asking us, when do we know that there's a wrong? When we are comfortable, not only comfortable, but we have the confidence that something is wrong. Then it is not so much the debate on relativism, but rather that there is a wrong. What should we do? And so I would say that these aren't necessarily the difficult questions. The difficult questions are in solving what is clearly wrong and what must we do about it. And so what I wanted to share with you with some of these slides that I can go through fairly quickly for our purposes here is, if we can go to slide 2, the next slide, please. Here we have what is the point of what happened after the Civil War. In the South, the Methodists, there was the Southern Methodists, as you know, but the Southern Methodists were in a quandary with what was going on as they sided first with deciding the sin and not the evil of slavery, or you could change that the other way. And so in this chapter, I'm talking about how so many different faiths came to the South, came to New Orleans and to South Louisiana on the heels of the end of the Civil War. Some of them got there before the war was over. As you know, New Orleans fell within a year to the Union. And what was their purpose? Why were they following these people? What good was it doing for them to come from the North to the South? So the Methodist North moved down to New Orleans for our purposes here with a vision in mind and a real sense of purpose. And their purpose was to educate the free people. In the history of slavery, one of the things that we don't talk about, and in the post-slavery period, is that we don't discuss enough, is that someone had to teach people who had been in the mines of bondage for over 250 years how to be free. And that was the purpose. And I would like to suggest to you that they were also there to help people to understand their own roles in society. And I believe that sometimes today we kind of push this to the side. But I doing this research and looking in the history of it ordinarily, that these were people who understood that the plight of the people who were once slaves and the impact that slavery had on free, poor white people would mean that people would need to learn how to be contributors to their society, or else society would be doomed. And so as you read this quote, this is what their reason for being rested on. That they would come here, the Methodists came, where these two quote-unquote races or cultures would meet with a common interest to consider the good, not the injury of the community. Next slide, please. And then we see them arrive and to look at what the aims of schooling would be. And so I said the university, many of them started where they needed to start, teaching people how to read, adults, from elementary level. And the Methodists came, and following them, you'll see the Congregationalists came, and they started there. But with this notion of piety, and this interest in developing the moral character of people, here, this is from directly quoting from what the Methodists in New Orleans said. They wanted people who were fit to lead, but not too proud to follow, who could walk with crowds and keep their virtue, walk with kings and not lose the common touch. The next slide, please. And I'm not going to read all this to you because I hate those kind of things that put it there and then read it back to you. So look at that and digest that as you are planning to discuss. But this line to remove the conscious weight of bondage. So the law removed that, but how do you remove that from the mind? And the religious then came there to help them to see that. They had to learn what freedom meant. I was just having a conversation this morning at breakfast and talking about what it means to retire and to retire from work. And I've seen so many people in my walks in the morning who are retired, and they are aimless and lost because they lived, as my father-in-law said, who was bombed at Pearl Harbor and had some terrible things happen to him in the war that he hardly made it out alive. And then he said, I worked since I was 14 years old. I went to the war. I raised all my children, and they're decent people, and now it's me. And so he retired, and he sat there. He was a master mechanic, called on by the parish in our state so that he could testify on the particularities of a lawsuit concerning automobiles. And he was so proud that he studied somewhere in Chicago and had a Doctor of Motors degree. And yet this mind sat there and vegetated because he said, I don't want to work anymore. I just don't want to do anything. And so look at this quote. To understand what freedom meant here, they're saying it meant not license to idle, but liberty to be industrious. And so as we were saying this morning, when people are retiring today, and the baby boomers are somewhat changing this whole dynamic of retirement by saying, now I need to find out what I can do because I still need purpose in my life and I need meaning. What else do I do that I can do? And so this is what this means. You have the freedom to do the work that you want to do. And then, of course, let me catch up with the slides here. There were challenges. The church in New Orleans that had political support from the Union after it was captured was a church called Ames Methodist Episcopal Church on St. Charles Avenue. And that's where people who were sympathetic, pastors and clergy, came from the north and flooded into New Orleans so that they can then do what they needed to do. The next slide, they set up the Thomas Biblical Institute. Sorry, I don't know where I am here. The General Conference set up the Freedmen's Aid Society, which later became a part of the board, the General Board. And then next, the Thomas Biblical Institute is the oldest of those founded, and the African American religious schools like Dillard trace its founding back to these people. Some of those names I'm sure you're familiar with. Next. And then there was the Union Normal School. And it's just amazing in all those documents, and the primary documents as well as some of the written things on it. Ms. Rosetta Coit was the principal. She came with other teachers, and she is the one who would then take that school to some prominence. Next, please. And so the outcome of those would be, the next slide, would be the New Orleans University. And you can see the churches, the Methodist churches import in that. Next, please. And here you find the charter of New Orleans University. I have Emperor William's name there. He was important to signing this charter. Emperor Williams was born in 1826, a slave. And he was a master mason. As those of you who are historians know and students of history know that, of course, don't follow the movies. It's usually not accurate on what slavery was to everybody because, of course, slaves were needed and had all kinds of skills. And if you had a special skill, sometimes you can farm it out. And Emperor Williams would work and be able to give his master some money and keep enough, and he bought himself out of freedom. And he offered to buy his wife out of freedom. And they refused him in 1858. It was $2,000 for her, and they refused him, her slave owner. And so in 1861, when the Union came rolling in, he saved himself $2,000 and got his wife. But Emperor Williams is important to the story of Methodism in Louisiana. And he was an orator, a preacher, and the like, and you could see his signing. In 1869, well, actually in 1866, but in that the Congregationalists come through the American Missionary Association, and they establish through the behest of a Baptist named Seymour Strait. He made money in cheese in Ohio, and had moved down to New Orleans to do business, and he had a particular interest in educating the free people. And so Seymour Strait, the Baptist, came in and negotiated with the Congregationalists, hence you see all the title, the names of the religions, and they negotiated with the Methodists and the like. The only thing is that Seymour Strait said that, the next slide, that he didn't want to give money to another elementary school teaching. It had to be different, because it started to be too much competition and not enough money to be brought. So they started it off as a university. And so what I want to move down to is you see that Strait University, mentioning the dynamics. The next one, please. This is their board. And unlike New Orleans University, Strait University's board had both black and white people on it. And so if you just look at some of the names next, you'll see these were the African American members. These people were all well educated, having come through the South and the like. And they also had an integrated faculty next. And I want you to take a look quickly at this. Maybe this will help you in your discussions later. But just look at some of these names. And I didn't separate them. Go to the next one, please. I didn't separate them by color because you'll see how distinguished these people are. Both the black and white people at Straight were well educated, and look at the courses that they taught. Next, please. And so Straight University, you had to know all of that. New Orleans University evolved from the combination of the biblical institutes. And then New Orleans University and Straight into the 20th century merged. And they formed Dillard University. When some benefactors or potential benefactors were approached about supporting this new school, it wouldn't be Straight New Orleans, it would be a new name. They would say, well, let's see what you can come up that's new. One of the principal movers and shakers was a Jew, and his name was Edgar B. Stern. And were it not for Edgar B. Stern and his wife was the daughter of Julius Rosenwald, you know him, right? And others and the like, then the money may not have been there for Dillard at that time. And it may not have gained its prominence because these people gave their money. At his funeral or his memorial service, the rabbi quoted Stern, said that life is a stewardship, and we are but the stewards of whatever we possessed. Next, please. And as we move into understanding how all these different faiths came together, on Dillard's board, Dillard ended up being formed in 1935 as the other two schools dissolved, New Orleans and Straight into Dillard. And it became a very prominent university. It wasn't there just for African Americans, but the law would not allow non-black people to attend. It is today resting in a beautiful neighborhood, which is where it was first set, and you're gonna see those. We'll run through those quickly. On the board were Congregationalists, Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and of course among those were African Americans and others who were there in Dillard's founding. Many black universities, or today what we call HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, did not have black presidents very early on. Dillard was no exception until its third president came, and that was Albert Dent. So this quote is to say that it was memorialized in Stern because of his work. If you come to New Orleans and you're on Gentilly, just down from Elysian Fields Avenue, you'll see the beautiful campus of Dillard. All its buildings are white. It looks like a New England little church village. Its chapel is Congregationalist in its simplicity and its beauty and the like. And so the campus continued that consistency to today. All those different people, how do we bring them all together? Next, please. This is Bishop Robert Elijah Jones. Bishop Jones came to New Orleans from North Carolina. He is the dean, was the dean of Black Methodists. And when he was on the board of New Orleans University and so on and so forth, but his most thing is that he was at the reunification of the church in North and South in the 30s, and he had to give up something. And that's what we asked last night. When do we know something is wrong? We really know something is wrong. And we leave out cultural pluralism. We leave out the discussions of relativism. And that's what Dr. Patel asked us. And what do we do? And in the Methodist Church in the 1930s, in reunification, Bishop Jones and others the black members had to give up something. And they had to give up a unified church based on color. There were 6 jurisdictions, 5 geographic, 1 by race, and he was the bishop of all black Methodists in the country. And that was a wrong. that the church could not settle. But yet, the religious continued to work on behalf of free people and others. The next slide is just quickly some scenes from Dillard when, in its earliest stages when it was being formed. The next slide is Dillard in the 1950s. If you look, just quickly, if you look to the screen at the upper left, that's part of the 17th Street Canal, that when Katrina hit, the levees broke right there and flooded the campus and flooded that neighborhood. So it is a little disquieting when I look out my window. I'm looking at that wall. The next one is also, this is an African-American Congregationalist, and his son became a doctor in Chicago and developed some groundbreaking techniques in medicine. And then, of course, these are, Mary McLeod, the next slide, please. Mary McLeod Bethune is in the middle. She founded what is now Bethune-Cookman College in Florida. She made a visit to New Orleans, and the woman she's standing with, whose picture is there, is Miss Fannie Williams. Miss Williams, a graduate of Straight, Miss Williams was one of the deans of black education in New Orleans, but she was also a Congregationalist, traveled around the country seeking interracial cooperation, and she was a member of some very important organizations because of that. So just running through them quickly. Next, please. This is Albert W. Dent, who was selected by Edgar Stern. He was a Morehouse graduate. He led, Dillard had a Flint Goodrich Hospital that it ran, noted nursing school and the like, and he was president. Next is Miss Rosa Keller, another important activist in New Orleans. And the reason why I'm showing you some of these people, especially as you see some of the white American people, they put a lot on the line. These people could have been hurt very badly. The reason why many of them weren't hurt so much is because they were very wealthy. Next slide, quickly. We'll see Edgar Stern with the emperor, the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, who came to Dillard University and met with Dent and Stern. And I think this is the last one here. Of Haile Selassie. They're in the main hall in Dillard. And then just for sentimental value, here's the Straight University class of 1906. When the Methodists came, the Congregationalists came, teamed up with Baptists and Episcopalians and others. They told us, they let us know the answer to what we're discussing today. When does the religious put aside its own particularism for common good? And that's a question that we're facing. That's what I approach in the chapter by using this specific model, is how do we do that? And they did it. And I'd like to suggest to you that they looked at humanity and decided it was bigger than whether I'm a Jew or Christian or among Christians, one of the different denominations. What is the common good? The wrong they didn't solve was what society looked at among racial issues. But then lastly, in answer to the person who said, so when do we determine that changing minds is not possible? Sometimes we have to forego changing minds for the common good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. I want to thank Mark and Matthew for inviting me to participate in this conference. Of course, I'd be giving my main address at lunchtime. But at this meeting, at this time, I would like to give a summary of the chapter that I have written for the book. I was asked to write a little broader subject of how the interfaith movement began and what were the ways in which Christian church began to engage with it, and then go on to say about Methodism. What is it in Methodism that what contribution Methodism can bring to interfaith relations? So I am not going to do the first part, the historical part, which is in the book. I've been asked at this one to talk something about interfaith movement and Methodism. When I joined from my biography in the program, you would know that I worked in the World Council of Churches for 16 years, 12 of it as director of the Interfaith Dialogue Program of the World Council of Churches. When I joined the World Council of Churches, the General Secretary was Dr. Philip Potter, Methodist from the Caribbean. One of the two Deputy General Secretaries was Mercy Amba Odioye from Ghana, Methodist. Then we have a department of subunit on interfaith dialogue. The director was John Taylor, a Methodist from the United Kingdom. The person responsible for Judaism was Alan Brockway of the United Methodist Church here in the USA. And I was responsible for Hindu-Buddhist relations, a Methodist from Sri Lanka. Now, Kenneth Cracknell, interfaith officer of the British Council of Churches, said, there is something suspicious here. All the main people leading ecumenism and interfaith are all Methodists. There is something about Methodism that must be congenial for ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. Now, this is not really true. Now, there have been other denominations that have provided general secretaries, and there are Episcopals and Baptists who have been in the interfaith work. But there is some truth in what Kenneth Cracknell said. Is there something in Methodism that opens us to be more ecumenical and more interfaith relation? And that is a question that I want to share in the short time that I have. Now, very often we talk about Wesleyan theology and Methodist theology, and there were some people tried to somehow make Methodist theology of Wesley's time come real in our time. But Wesley, as you have pointed out, lived in the 18th century, 1700 he was born, and he responded to a particular situation of his time. Therefore, Methodist theology has to do with how we can interpret what Methodism stood for and worked for and meant at that time, and how it can make a contribution to the 21st century. Therefore, what I want to do is to highlight two aspects of Wesley's theology or Methodist theology that can make a real contribution to interfaith relations in our time. I want to divide in these two parts. One is Wesley's methodology, and the other is Wesley's theology. Now, Wesley was born in the vicarage. He was an Anglican priest. His father was an Anglican priest, Oxford educated. He was very well read in all the theological streams of that time. He was in early church, then the Reformation, Orthodox theology. He knew a lot, and he was a great scholar. But for him, Christian faith in its theological response, it must be a responsive theology, a theology that is responsive to the situation in which the church finds itself. So John Wesley's theology is responsive theology, responsive to the situation of that time, post-industrial revolution, and the socio-economic problems that they were facing, and the situation of the ordinary people in Great Britain at that time, and how can the Christian faith interpret itself, or its theology can respond to the actual realities of that time. So Christian theology is faith responding to the realities of that time. And what is our reality today is what I would like to speak at lunchtime. But I want to first make that point that Methodism is a responsive theology. It responds to the context in which it comes. Secondly, John Wesley was not in his methodology limited by what the earlier Roman Catholic Church saw as the primary tools for doing theology, or what the Reformation did. In the Roman Catholic Church at that time, tradition was the main category for doing theology. And scripture was used to support what the tradition was teaching. The church had the magisterium, the capacity to teach. And the church interpreted the scripture and justified the teachings that it was having. Therefore, the scripture was subservient to the tradition. And the tradition was controlled by the clergy of the church. Therefore, there was a tension between reformers and the Roman Catholic Church. And the reformers went the other extreme and said, sola scriptura, scripture alone. So whereas one side was saying tradition alone, the other side was saying scripture alone. Of course, both are not alone really. The tradition used scripture, and Luther accepted most of the classical theology. But he wanted to free the Bible from the control of the church, and therefore he said by scripture alone. And the greatest thing that happened for Reformation is not only that he stood there and said, I cannot do otherwise, stood by his 95 Theses, but when he was given sanctuary in the Princess, he translated the Bible from the Latin to German. When Bible was only in Greek and Hebrew and Latin, only the clergy were able to read and interpret it. So the people had to accept the interpretation that was given by the clergy. What the Luther did was to free the Bible from the control of the church by translating it into the language of the people. And this is a tradition that Reformation has now followed, so that people can themselves read the Bible and see whether what the church teaches is in conformity with what. But what he did was he went further. He had what we called a Wesleyan quadrilateral. He said theology must take not only the tradition, not only the scripture, but must use reason and must respond to the experiences that we have. So he had 4 categories for doing theology. That was a great breakthrough from what has happened earlier. Tradition, scripture, reason, and experience. Experience doesn't mean just personal experience. What is the experiential reality in which that we live? Therefore, Methodist theology today cannot simply quote scripture. Methodist theology today cannot simply say this had been our tradition. They have to ask, what does the scripture say? What has been the tradition? What do we as reasoning people think about those things today, and how can that theology respond to the actual realities in which we live? So Wesley had a very revolutionary approach to how to do theology. It is not only scripture, not only tradition, but reason. And what is our experience as individuals and as a church. So the second methodological revolution was how the tools for doing theology. And the third very important methodological innovation that Methodism brought was that it was an integrated theology. That John Wesley held the personal and the social, experiential and the intellectual, and the immediate and the eschatological together. He not only thought about personal holiness, but social holiness. He not only asked for discipleship that has to do with individual life, but how does discipleship work itself in social life, economic life, political life. Therefore, he wanted to hold the personal and the social together, and the intellectual, as a great theologian, he studied a lot, but experienced together, and immediate and eschatological together. Because otherwise people promised you heaven, but didn't care much about here. But he said he held those two things together. And for him, theology had to do with how to help the people, the churches, to become truly disciples. Now, Wesleyan theology is what I call people's theology. When I had to do Reformation theology, and in my seminary, I had to read Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, which is a massive book. But when I had to do Methodist theology for my ministry, I had to read sermons and I had to read journals and hymns in order to do them. Wesley could have written a great systematic theological book, but he gave his theology through sermons, through journals, through letters, and through hymns, along with Charles Wesley. Accessible, usable theology, given to people in a way that they can grasp. It is said that he used to preach a sermon to his maid, and only if she understood that sermon, he will preach it in the church. Mm-hmm. A sermon that cannot be understood by ordinary people is not useful. Therefore, one of the problems we have in the academic circles is that professors writing books for other professors. See, I was one of the professors, I think, who refused to write a book for the professors. And I wrote books only for the congregations. It is a scholarship that is taken, but always interpreted for congregation, because that is the Wesleyan tradition. The people are the object or the subject of what the theological work that has to do. Therefore, there's a methodological approach that Methodism had, which was very much ecumenical, because he used the church for early church theologians, he used the Reformation theology, he used the Roman Catholic theology, he used Orthodox theology, he was influenced by Armenians. Let truth come from wherever it is. His spirit, the ecumenical spirit that he had in approach to theology and where he looked for sources is a dominant, is a very, very important lesson that we have to learn. So much for methodology. Then in the short time that I have, I would like to highlight three of the theological dimensions of John Wesley, which this time I want to mainly speak about interfaith relations. So Wesley had a concept of grace, which is called the Catholicity of grace. Wesley was revolutionary in thinking that God's grace is available to everybody, irrespective of who you are. It doesn't matter what religion you belong to, what group you belong to, free in all and free for all. God's grace is free in all and free for all. Therefore, nobody is outside God's grace. This is a very strong fundamental principle of Methodism. And he broke away from the anthropology of the traditional church and the Reformation. The Reformation anthropology and the classical theological anthropology saw man or the human being as a totally fallen person, totally deprived, and nothing, they can do nothing for themselves. Therefore, only God has to do something, and he had to do that God has to do this through Jesus Christ. But John Wesley never believed in that. He said everybody is given the intellect and the conscience in order to act in the way that is convenient with God. So if somebody does not have the gospel message presented to them, they will be judged by how they live their life according to their conscience and the free will that they had. And he compared it to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Where was Jesus at that time? How does God judge the patriarchs? God judges the patriarchs. Therefore, he saw conscience is not something natural, but also God-given. Therefore, this urgency to convert all the people to become part of the church, the idea that the perishing millions, that cannot come from Methodism. when you preach the gospel, you heap grace upon grace. Already God's grace is there. Then you move them into a new dimension of the understanding of grace. How free it is, how profound it is, how undeserved it can be. Therefore, you heap grace upon grace. You move people to a deeper and fuller understanding of who God is and how God deals with you. So that was Wesley's understanding of grace. Therefore, he had an anthropology that was very important for interfaith relations. I don't see a Hindu as somebody deprived of God or somebody who needs Jesus Christ before he comes to God. God is already present. And what I am giving him or her is another dimension of who that God is and how that God deals with us. Nobody is outside God's grace. You couldn't have had a more important contribution for interfaith relations than what Joe did with the concept. And then he went a little further. We have in the Methodism what is called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is a grace that goes before. Before I meet a Hindu or a Muslim or a Jew or anybody else and want to talk about Jesus Christ and His grace, grace is already at work with them. It is God's grace that can help them to respond to them. There's already a grace previous to my approaching my brother or my sister. So that I don't meet a person who would be perish if I don't meet that person, but I'm meeting a person with whom already Christ is present. Of course, John Wesley went to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Word that enlightened everybody that comes into the world. That Word is already there. That prevenient grace is already there. And what I do when I bring the gospel is to build on that grace that is already there. Therefore, when I meet a Hindu who had a profound religious life, when I meet a Buddhist who has an enormous sense of what is right and wrong and totally nonviolent in their approach, when I meet a Muslim whose understanding of community is something much greater than in ours, I see prevenient grace at work. Already God is at work with them. And it is in that context that I can give witness to what we have come to know about God in Jesus Christ.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank the panel for their. We have about 25 more minutes. Thanks, Matt. No. That was Matt giving me instructions. Thank you, Matt. We have about 25 more minutes. During that time, if you take about 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to pass these questions around for your tables. These are tabletop questions for you to discuss. It'll help to kind of frame some of the conversations we've had up here, we've introduced you to. And so talk amongst yourselves. You can talk about our talks themselves. You can try to answer these questions. But then we'll, after you've spoken amongst yourselves for a few minutes, then we'll turn and ask you to engage us, and we'll have some conversation before we have a break in about half an hour. So let me go ahead and pass these around. Might get some help doing that.
Everybody's argument is called the 2% is about.
I'm going to call your attention back up this way, please. And we're going to spend the next about 10 minutes engaged in conversation amongst the room. So I'm going to ask you to wrap those conversations up at your table. So hopefully you've had a moment to talk amongst yourselves about either our presentations, our chapters in the book, the conversational table questions I passed around to you, or you have your own things you want to talk about, which are perfectly fine as well. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes to do that. And so does anybody want to share the conversation they had with their table? They just want to go ahead and ask a question up front. And if you do need to ask a question, Steffi right there behind you has a microphone. So anybody want to go first?
But you can get it in Amazon.
Anybody want to jump into this conversation? Excellent. All right. Yep. Oh, here we go.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I just kind of wanted to kind of summarize a little bit about the discussions that were taking place at our table. So a good majority of us are from Columbia College, but we had the pleasure of also speaking with our neighbors who are coming from different institutions to kind of give us more of a collective perspective on what goes on at different institutions. And I guess some of the highlights that we were talking about necessarily is more along the lines of like the initiatives that are happening on campus in terms of like how students are taking organizations and they're basically trying to help out in bridging different gaps. As I spoke about last night, I'm the president for a Muslim Student Association, and I tried to help bridge, tear down certain boundaries or certain misconceptions that surround Islam. And we also talk about, you know, how in general it also kind of bridges the gap in terms of like different issues that are taking place or social justice issues that are taking place right now. So we were able to kind of really dissect that and kind of look back at our institution and necessarily incidences that could have that have happened that could have, you know, we could have grown from it. But at least now there's the understanding of that and how we can necessarily move forward, and you know what the place is for faculty and staff and students and the roles that they play on the campus. So we took that to heart when all three of you wonderful speakers were talking about that and make those connections to our campus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I almost fell. All right. Thank you for your presentations. And our conversation, we tried to look at each article, and you know, one thing that was hard for some of us to identify with Dillard's history is this radical attention to how do you address people with a consciousness of bondage and help them own their new freedom. And so just thinking by analogy, like how if we preserve this liberal arts ideal of institutions, that we do have students who come to us who do, you know, and I'm not by analogy loosely, right? They are thinking that they have to do this assignment or they have to go to college, that they do kind of have a mindset of not understanding their own freedom and owning their own freedom too. So trying to follow this question with number one, going, it's really hard to say that the founding of my institution had the similar mission, but to look at the liberal arts ideal there. For the second one, the second question, we were talking about the possible issue of inclusivism as a philosophical position where if we see others like a Buddhist as, like I really wanted you to give an atheist as having God's grace in them too. You know, like you listed Buddhists, you listed Hindus, but to be able to see a humanist or an atheist as having God's grace too, that would be the harder moment to see that it's maybe helpful for Methodists to see possibilities in their own tradition as helpful for interfaith projects, but it may not, and so maybe by analogy, others could learn from that. But in a way, it seems that there's this condescension of, you're Christian, but you just don't know it yet. The worry of that. And then we didn't quite get too thorough with Tim's, but we did talk about the move from this inclusivism or everybody has this same underlying of chapter 2, the same underlying religious kind of dimension to them, but we all articulate it in different ways where that kind of dismisses differences and instead trying to figure out ways to respect particular differences in this third chapter.
Yeah.
That's what we talked about.
Thank you. Well, I guess we'll each respond. You want to start?
Yeah, I think that, my purpose in using this history is so that you can substitute whatever your particular situation is. But I've drawn the conclusion that it's the humanity that you're looking for.
Fundamentals of the faith.
And what is the common good? As Dr. Patel talked about our democracy, and that's the point of the democracy here. What is for the common good? If we invoke politics, do you elect leaders who are just for some of the people? It doesn't matter which political persuasion they are. And if others perceive them to be just for some people and not others, then it's not for the common good. And the democracy can't survive it. And as far as you're looking at it on campuses, this academic notion and in the traditional classical model, that was the point, that you can't be a university unless you have a strong liberal arts community so that you can encourage this kind of intellectual freedom and exploration. And so you may use any particular example that you may like that's applicable to your own school. In the using Dillard, it was to show that all these people from different faith groups came together, and they did not have to proselytize on their own particular faith to be able to accomplish something, and it was for the greater good. I like that one quote I read some years ago from Julius Rosenwald. He said that we must understand that if we don't further the ability of, at the term he used, Negro, because it was early 20th century, of the Negro, the country can't survive it. So what is the common good? And so it may be, as this young lady spoke over here, it may be taking the purpose and the meaning of getting people to understand what we have in common. Alain Locke, they call the father of the Renaissance, who was a philosopher in his own right. He said what we need to do is find out what we have in common rather than what we don't have in common. And when we find that, then we will be able to make progress. But until then, if we stay in our tribes, if we become so provincial in our existences, then of course our any society may not make itself. So, or further itself. So whether it's the cause of Dillard with all these people flooding into New Orleans after the Civil War and then into the 20th century, and by 1935 you have another university that's the culmination of all these different people who saw fit to even use their personal monies for the common good of the city, of the nation, of the state and the nation, then they had to find their common humanity. And so I would suggest to each of you to find that in your own situations, whether it's your own college, your own homes, your own communities, no matter what it is. The overriding question that I pose in my own chapter here is, what is the common good? And where is humanity? And so that takes hard work, but it is possible that it can happen.
Thank you. Yeah, since it's a very short presentation, I couldn't cover the problems that can be seen in that. I mean, as you know, in the theology of religions, we have these four typology: exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. And in the inclusivist position, whether it is the unknown Christ of Hinduism or Panika, or anonymous Christians or Karana, etc., the danger of what you are saying is there. To say that your faith, what you do not know, is actually Christ is with you. And your salvation that you experience is what Christ has given to you. Now, I am not an inclusivist. I am really a follower of John Hick, a pluralist. And the pluralist position is this, that God loves, we are all children of God. God has, I like what Peter discovered. God has no partiality, and in every nation, those who fear him is acceptable to him. So all of us are equally the children of God. It doesn't matter what religion, whether you have religion. From God's side, there is only love, and therefore all of us are God's children. That is the first beginning. Then all religions are responses to God, and they are very much guided by the philosophical, psychological, and historical and cultural situations in which you come. Therefore, you cannot expect a response to God in the Middle East and the response to God in Asia to be the same. So, he doesn't say that it's true, but all religious responses are valid. That's John Hick's word. All of them are valid because within their culture, within their philosophical system, etc., this is the response they were able to make. Therefore, we cannot sit on judgment on any response to God. God only can judge. Therefore, everybody is equally valid in the sight of God. Now, does it mean that all religions are equally the same? No. That's a point. Because each response is different and they have their strengths and weaknesses. And therefore, Christians have a very specific witness to give to who God is and how God deals with us in and through the experience of Jesus Christ. This is specific to them. Therefore, I am not a Muslim, I am not a Hindu, I am a Christian. So I have a particular window into God, in Jesus Christ, to which I will bear witness. But in order for me to do that, I must believe that God is already, that's what my point. I am not going to somebody who doesn't have God. God is already loving that person. Secondly, I am not going to a person who has not responded to God. They have already made their response to God. So what I am doing it, how does this window through which I see God can help, enhance, etc. Now, I can do that only if I am also open for the Hindu to witness to me the God whom they know in and through their window. And I must say, as somebody who had studied Hinduism up to doctoral level, that I have learned so much about God through Hinduism as much I have learned from God from Jesus Christ. That's the discipline of interfaith relations. That we have a specific witness, so do everybody else to who God is. And all of them have their faults and strengths. And interfaith dialogue, there is mutual enrichment, mutual correction, and mutual growth in our understanding of who God is and how God deals with us.
Thank you. I'll just respond very quickly, Eric, and then we'll have a break. What I'd say is that the chapter 3 is a commentary on the emergence of particularism as an alternative to inclusivism, exclusivism, and pluralism. And so particularism is a postmodern approach, and the general notion is that there has to be some sort of foundational form that gives the intelligibility to your claims. And those intelligibility creates the context in which you can have conversations, and you do have conversations. And so it's okay to create that foundation or to rely upon it because you need something where you need to stand. But then the possession of that foundation does not mean you cannot allow other people to walk on the ground with you. But we have another hour, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to have these conversations. We'll have to go. So by grace, we're done. But thank you all very much. It's been lovely. We appreciate it. You'll have about a 15-minute break, and then we'll be gathered back for our second panel, which you will be blessed to hear from. But thank you much. I want to thank you with my co-panelists today, and thank you all very much for listening and engaging, and we look forward to the rest of it.